Bruce Mann is in the chat.
Hello, good evening everyone, and welcome to the 2020 Mann Lecture. I'm Dr. Gwyn Threlkeld, and I'm the Pro-Vice Chancellor Regional at La Trobe University, and it's my pleasure to welcome you this evening. La Trobe University acknowledges that this event and our participants are located on the lands of many traditional custodians in Australia. We recognise their ongoing connection to the land and value their unique contribution to the university and wider Australian society. We're committed to providing opportunities for Indigenous Australians, both as individuals and communities, through teaching and learning, research and community partnerships across all our campuses and online. We pay our respects to Indigenous elders, past, present and emerging, and extend this respect to any Indigenous participants joining us this evening. I'm delighted that this is the 18th annual Mann Lecture, and as always, we extend our warm welcome to members of the Mann family who are joining us this evening. We're very grateful for the family's ongoing support of the Albury-Wodonga campus and for their commitment to continuing these important conversations about the Murray and its people. Professor Nick Bond from the Centre for Freshwater Ecosystems at the campus will officially introduce our guest shortly. But before I pass to Nick, I'd just like to cover the structure of this evening's event. Our guest, Phil Duncan, who we're delighted to have this evening, will present the 2020 Mann Lecture for about 40 minutes, and then we'll turn to Q&A, where we'll answer questions coming in live from the audience. You can submit your questions via the Q&A function you can see at the bottom of your screen. You're welcome to submit your questions at any time throughout Phil's presentation. Please be aware that there may be many questions and we only have a short time to get through them. So while your question may be shared with the audience, only a few will be presented to Phil for discussion. The webinar will be recorded and we'll send you the details and a link via the email address you provided when you registered. Now, I'd like to introduce Professor Nick Bond, Director of the Centre for Freshwater Ecosystems. Thanks, Nick.
Thanks very much, Gwyn, and welcome everyone. It's a great pleasure to introduce our speaker, Mr. Phil Duncan, this evening. Phil is from Gomeroi in New South Wales, and he's a member of the Gomeroi Nation and an elected representative of the Gomeroi Nation Native Title Claimant Group. Phil has nearly 40 years experience working with communities and government to improve the lives of Aboriginal people. And much of his work is focused on the recognition of Aboriginal people's rich cultural history, the return of their lands, the improvement of living conditions and education for the next generation. He has provided high-level policy and strategic advice and leadership to key Indigenous representative organisations, universities, state and federal government agencies, as well as key external stakeholder groups. He's particularly active around issues of cultural and heritage significance and community engagement in on-ground projects. He's also worked very closely with the science community to embrace Indigenous voices and to embrace cultural science. And I've had the great pleasure myself of working with Phil over many years, and I regard him as a fantastic colleague and friend. Among some of his most notable achievements, in the last year, Phil became the first Indigenous person to be appointed as the chair of the Murray-Darling Basin Community Committee, where Phil represents not only First Nations voices within the basin, but also chairs a committee that acts on behalf of all communities within the Murray-Darling Basin to provide an opportunity to speak on issues related to water management. With that, I'd like to welcome Phil, and I'm very much looking forward to your presentation. Thank you.
Here we go. Okay, screen's frozen. Yama Gabaninda. Sorry, I'm having difficulty with my PowerPoint. I'll try that. Okay, yeah. Sorry about that, people. But Yama Gabaninda, Phil, Duncan, Naya. That's hello and welcome. My name is Phil Duncan, and I am a very, very proud Gomeroi man from the Northwest Slopes and Plains of New South Wales. And it is a privilege to not only be chair of the Murray-Darling Basin Community Committee, but I also feel it privileged to be able to deliver this evening's Mann Lecture for La Trobe University. There's a couple of things as we go forward. I use the term cultural science, and it's a growing term that we now rise above traditional ecological knowledge and embrace our methodologies of interacting with country, caring for country and repairing for country. And it is being more and more recognised globally as cultural science, not just within Australia, but many other First Nations peoples around this globe. There's a couple of cliches I want to add. One of the opportunities I take in this evening's Mann Lecture is we can be better together. And I want to use my language and also say Warrigal Gali. That is straight true water talk. So I hope that I inform you, I hope I challenge you, but most of all, I hope I raise a greater curiosity for a greater appetite to learn about cultural science, our cultural way of life, our profound sense of responsibility to care for country, repair for country, and the spiritual connection we have. And I'm going to give you some examples, I hope, particularly from a Gomeroi man's perspective. And I think it's important that we continue to raise or create the windows of opportunities for Aboriginal voices to be raised across the water industry. And I think, well, I strongly believe that there is a strong platform for greater collaboration to go forward together. Across the world, or around the world, and particularly in Australia, in the science arena, we are, Aboriginal people are continuing to say, nothing about us without us. We want to be involved. We want to realise our potential. That is our obligation to inform people on how best, not only can we be involved, but together we can be involved in working together to restore the basin, this iconic basin. We will never get it back to its former glory, but at least we need to continue to work collaboratively, share our knowledge to get it back to the glory, part of that former glory. Because we will be judged by tomorrow's generation or the next generation. And that is, for me, that is the connector at the hip. I want my children, I want our children, I want the next generation to be having the same experiences on the rivers, the wetlands, the lakes, across this wonderful basin. So I hope that my messages of we can be better together resonate throughout my presentation. Throughout my life, just a little bit more about me. I'm the oldest of 127 grandkids. My dad's the oldest of 12. I come from a long line of shearers, and people in the rural sector have, not from my generation, but going back to my great-grandfather and continuing past my generation, to provide opportunities in the rural sector. So I have again, a very strong, sound commitment to bringing those two together. But in the journey of life, we have many mentors. And this is my grandfather in the top right-hand corner. He is standing under the tree that he was born under at Terry Hi, which is 27 kilometres out of Gomeroi at the foothills of the Nandewar Ranges. And that's me down the bottom left-hand side standing under that tree. To everybody else, it's just a plain old pepper tree. But to me and my family and my many cousins, it is our birthing tree. That tree, at the base of that tree, is the placenta of my grandfather and his sisters. But I also want to acknowledge the many, many other mentors that are non-Aboriginal, that have helped shape me into the person I am, and that continue to make very strong, sound commitments to working collaborations with Aboriginal people across the basin and across this country. So we all need mentors in our life. This is my grandfather, and I share that with you. It's not just our cultural landscapes in land. This is my dreaming. This is the dhinawan, the emu that lives in the Milky Way. This is my mother. So we are not just guided by our cultural landscapes, our carved and scarred trees, our boundaries, which are usually waterways, our main arteries, but we are driven and guided by our constellations. And as you can see, I've done an outline. Now, when the dhinawan's legs are down, that is when the dhinawan or the emu is laying eggs. And that's where people who are able to hunt and gather know when it's best to go and collect emu eggs. So again, it's not just the land and the objects on the land. We are guided by what I call our Aboriginal constellations. And many, many other nations have this profound sense of attachment, or not sense, but profound attachment to those constellations. This is my Songline connection to country. It is that of Boobera Lagoon. And that Songline connection to country is that of Garia. And our law, L-O-R-E, tells us that Garia still exists in Boobera Lagoon. And our songlines tell us how we interact with that significant site, that cultural site of significance to our families, our clans, our nation. And these are the type of connectivity and the spiritual and profound responsibility that we want to share with everybody. And we want to create the two-way knowledge exchange. We want you to learn about this cultural responsibility and our cultural way of life. So this slide hopefully reinforces the terminology I use about our cultural way of life as a science, a cultural science. So in 1857, we see people along the Murray River. And then, 2017, we see the impacts of drought. And, we need to look at. I think that what I'm saying here is that sometimes we need to walk into the future looking backwards to remind us of the type of environment that we've left behind, and look at how we can reinvigorate that environment and bring it back to its former glory, or part of its former glory. I'm also in my second term with CSIRO on the National Indigenous Strategic Advisory Council, chaired by a very good mentor of mine, Professor Michael Dodson, or Mick Dodson. And this is the banner for the CSIRO leadership team at our stall at the Gomeroi Festival. And it says Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples, Australia's first scientists. So for us as a people, the past is relevant today. We know our cultural landscapes, and we want to share that with you. The fire stick management, which I'll pick up later, and many other ways that we interact with our cultural landscapes is there to learn, because we have what I call this symbiotic relationship. We exist in harmony and in pain with our cultural landscapes. We don't want to see our cultural sites of significance destroyed, as we have seen in the not too distant past. So our doors are open. We are here, and I hope that my talk again raises that greater curiosity for us to be learning and sharing this knowledge. Part of that knowledge is I never really understood my grandfather when he was talking about the Northern Basin being the lungs of the basin. And this is a map of the rivers in Australia. And if you have a look at this area where I am from, it is a lung. My nation has 9 rivers, the Great Artesian Basin, and the International Ramsar site at the Guaita Wetlands, the Gingham Waterhole. And it is a place where we can learn, where we can share knowledge, where we can increase the curiosity of tomorrow's scientists to take it to the next level and integrate Indigenous knowledge throughout our learning programs and our teachings. When we move across our country prior to colonisation, we had to know the cultural landscapes. These are the Weengallen Rockwells between Gundawindi and St George in southwest Queensland. And when our people came down to Boobera Lagoon to do business and ceremony, this was a stopover place because it had water holes. It provided an overnight stay. And where there's water, there is food. So it was an annual migration of the people to Boobera Lagoon along these tracks. In my life at Macquarie University, which is soon to come to an end, I have the wonderful pleasure of meeting and having a now what I call a great relationship with Professor Richie Howard. And he observes specific threats to Indigenous territories and the ability of Indigenous people to sustain our cultural relationships, our duties and our customs involving our traditional lands, accompany these general processes threatening Indigenous survival. Now there's a message in there. From a global perspective, First Nations people, we are a minority of the global population. We are 300 million of 7,000 million people. And many of those First Nations peoples are still oppressed, marginalised and dispossessed of land, water, knowledge and a cultural way of life. The legacy of dispossession continues in economic, social and political disadvantage. In 2019, the Productivity Commission's report, Overcoming Indigenous Disadvantage, exposes the continuing high levels that we as Indigenous communities and individuals face in Australia. And they are across a wide range of indicators, including health, access to justice and education, and abnormally high levels of incarceration. When we talk about our desire to be engaged, one of the difficult things as an Indigenous person or Indigenous peoples as nations, we find is that we always have to look at planning for only 4 years. And we have to navigate the instruments such as the 2000 Water Act, the Land Rights Act, the Native Title Act, the Conservation Biodiversity Act. But fundamentally, we have a right to be engaged. Section 211 of the Native Title Act gives us access. But, you know, for me, we shouldn't be using instruments and law. We should be using goodwill. And that goodwill can come on the platform of free, prior and informed consent, as outlined in the United Nations Declaration of the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, particularly Article 29. Our cultural values, you know, water is protected by law, not land, air and water as in LAW, but our law. It is in our songlines, it's in our dance, it's in our dreaming stories and our artworks. We must reconnect with our traditional knowledge, our traditional water knowledge, and our methodologies of interacting with these cultural landscapes and these resources. We want to continue to raise the voices of our old people and understand how we did science, how they did science, how they passed that knowledge down to us. But it's got to be done in a culturally safe environment where we can have courageous conversations. And this can only lead to stronger partnerships, greater on-ground projects that can validate our science, that cultural science. But for me, the real art is Western science and cultural science. For years, they have been clashing. For me, they do coexist. I've seen it coexist. It currently coexists. So we have this wonderful opportunity to come together, to set the platform up for the next generations. So the continuation of these water-dependent cultural values, creation sites, our cultural hero stories, linking with spiritual significance along our songlines, along these major arteries, and the many other outer branches that link into our arteries, the dreaming tracks, our dreaming sites, songline stories. They're all interwoven within our ceremonies and our cultural way that we interact with those cultural landscapes. Language. Well, language was the first thing that was taken away from us. But now we see a greater desire to learn more about this language. We talk about Australia as a country. Across this country called Australia, we have 326 plus other nations, and all have different languages. So we are as diverse as a people as when we talk about multiculturalism, but we all stand on the cultural platform of we want to be better together with you. And in fact, we can be. So we need to understand about how these resource sites for traditional bush foods and medicines. You know, I am always grateful for elders from other nations who sit and talk about their native vegetation that have medicinal values. You know, there are other resource sites for our artifacts, our tools, our arts, our crafts, you know, water for axe head and axe head preparations, aquatic reeds for weaving. You know, the gender specific sites that we need to understand, we need to create a greater appreciation that there is men's and women's business. I can't talk about women's business, but I know that in the water arena, in the water industry, we need to create the opportunity for a greater voice from Indigenous women. The ceremonial sites, birthing sites, burial sites, sites known, but there are also sites that are unknown. And the only way we can, we would like to share that from a lot of people that I get to interact with, is this relationship. We're not going to just give that significant knowledge. It needs to be earned. It needs to be via a relationship. It needs to be on the platforms of respect, relationships, and reciprocity, giving back. Because we as a people are always giving. It's a fundamental way of life and the generosity of our culture that we want to share. So continuing with the surface water and groundwater specific values, our teaching sites, the Nyemba people have Byami's Nunu, the Brewarrina fish traps, but Byami's Nunu. And you know, today it is still managed as a functionable educational site, not just for Indigenous children, but for all our children. It is visited weekly by other schools from around that area and also from the cities. There are massacre sites. The frontier battles occurred within our traditional groups. One of the most significant in my nation was the Myall Creek Massacre. But today it is now the Myall Creek Reconciliation Massacre site. And, you know, it's the coming together of people to create that safe environment where we can meditate, where we can learn, we can absorb the lessons of the past, so we don't make those mistakes as we go forward together. Cultural specific environmental conditions to sustain our totemic species or cultural keystone species. The Yutundali, the goanna, is my nation's totem, but so is Bigibilla, the echidna, Bunda, the kangaroo, and Gangil, the white corella, the cockatoo. So, you know, water is centrality to our life, centrality to our cultural way of life, centrality to our teachings, and how we, our knowledge holders pass that stories and that knowledge down to our next generations. And those next generations should also be part of the wider community. Not just our next generations of science, it's got to be taught in schools, in our tertiary institutions. We had a cultural economy and it was sustainable. We were a bartering people and we were a sustainable hunters and gatherers. We only ever took what we needed for the time. The sites that contain physical and tangible evidence, the middens, the campsites, scarred and carved trees, stone arrangements, as I've mentioned, the fish or the eel traps with the Gunditj Mirring down with Damien Bell's mob. Our tribal boundaries were usually marked by hills, but also by rivers, creeks, and seasonal indicators and indicators of the health and country and water. I can remember my grandfather telling me that he was never allowed to go into the waterways with any animal fat or ceremonial paint on him because of fear of upsetting the ecological cycle and the native fish populations, the aquatic habitat. Now, these are lessons that my grandfather left with me, such as the story of that the northern, the Gomeroi are the lungs of the basin with our 9 rivers. This is the type of knowledge we are willing to share. We want to share. So I think there are a couple of challenges that I want to throw out as we go forward into the second half of my presentation. We have a vision as a people. It's Indigenous-led water science and units. Now, what I'm saying there is we can take the lead, but we can do this with you and take you on that journey of researching and integrating Western science with our cultural values, with our cultural science. We would like to see the establishment of a First Peoples Water Advisory Body. When the abolition of the National Water Commission arrived, so did the First Peoples Water Engagement Council. And we were doing some profound work in that space with many nations. I think from memory, on the 29th and 30th of April in 2012 in Adelaide, we had the first ever First Peoples National Water Summit. 400, nearly 500 people coming together to work on a national policy for the benefit of Aboriginal people to be included. Amendments to the acts, amendments to instruments that allow us to realise and be involved in the planning and the decision making. I believe that we should have a First Peoples Water think tank, a CRC. We are now looking at the reinvigoration and the readoption or penning of a First Peoples Water Strategy. Now, we got this wonderful organisation called the Commonwealth Environmental Water Holder. I believe that there is space for us to coexist and have a First Peoples water holder, a First Nations people's water holder. And if you can imagine what we could do together, collaboration at the most senior level in the decision-making of our iconic basin and the many, many other basins and valleys across this country called Australia. We can make a difference together. And that is something that we should be exploring in every aspect of our lives, whether it be in the lecture room, in the classroom, or in the corridors of power in Parliament. And even in the corridors of our workspaces, in the corridors of our home, on the streets of our communities. I think that I believe we need to start having these courageous conversations and bring one another together and sit at the table and be involved in the decision-making together. One of the struggles people have is cultural appropriate engagement. I don't have the answers, but this is a model that I use, and it's underpinned by leadership. So Aboriginal people, we are always looking for partnerships. And as we go forward with the impacts of COVID, drought, fire, we are going to be living in a world of shrinking resource availability. But what price do we put on our ability or our desire, or our willingness to share our knowledge, to create or design projects that have outcomes for a range of stakeholders, in particular First Nations people? We need our rights protected. We need them to be acknowledged that we do have rights as a First Nations people of this country. So everything that I do revolves around our cultural values, my cultural values. And as a people, we are always revisiting the opportunity to create a heightened understanding, to further increase the relationship opportunities, our networks, our champions, our next generation of champions. And we move forward. And as we move forward, we need to look at the windows of opportunities on how we can co-design, bilingualize. And it's about participation. And that can only lead to a greater opportunity to influence governments, our stakeholders, in their willingness to come together. So in relation to Minister Pitt's announcements a couple of weeks ago, and I think that this is the time is now for us to do this better together. I think we have a wonderful opportunity that we need to embrace. When you get the opportunity to go out on country, this is the Barkindji people, Uncle Badger Bates, showing the map of the wonderful Menindee Lake system. And it has 6,000 plus known recorded sites. But with Uncle Gerald, Quayle, Barb and Cheryl on the right-hand side, we've been informed that there are more and more out there that they won't share that knowledge because they are sites of significance such as burial sites, birthing sites. And there is how we learn. That's a perfect example of Uncle Badger showing us in the dirt on how that systems work within the lakes. So our cultural science and knowledge on country should be embraced. There should be a greater uptake to go and sit with our elders, to sit with our key decision makers on country. You can't get this experience sitting inside four walls. I know that COVID has had a major impact But when we see our borders come down, I would love to see a greater migration and interaction and engagement with First Nations people across this country, and particularly across this wonderful basin. Again, you know, senior people from the Murray-Darling Basin Authority taking the opportunity upon an invitation to go and sit and listen and walk the country with people. That was a wonderful opportunity, and it had a profound impact on those people that came out from the Murray-Darling Basin Authority. I know our partner agencies, the Commonwealth Environmental Water Holder and DOR, the Department of Agriculture, Water and Environment, are already realising these wonderful cultural experiences, and the impact it is having on them is being taken back into workplace. And again, the key messages that keep resonating from these on-country experiences is about, we can be better together. Let's do it. To have the cultural knowledge exchange, I have this model or this ideology in my head about an exchange circle, because our lives as Aboriginal people, we have yarning circles, we have our elders that sit in circles to educate us, to do governance, to talk about our law, L-O-R-E, and also our customs. So if we have the opportunity to create the two-way learning together, we could build it could be a two-way capacity building. We can assist water planners, modelers, hydrologists, fish scientists, build on your cultural capacity and your integrity, because that can only make you better at what you do. You know, we want to be engaged on the platform of free, prior and informed consent. And we can be innovative on how we do this. We have become absolutely fantastic at the IT platforms. That's just one, but there is nothing like the on-country, face-to-face experience. And I hope and I trust that in the not too distant future, everybody in this joining in the Mann Lecture this evening will get that opportunity. Aboriginal people, we have always been somewhat operating from a deficit position. We've always had a desire to be heard, and we need to create the safe and empowering spaces for Indigenous opinions, for our knowledge, for us to express ourselves and our rights to be engaged. The key to all this is facilitating meaningful relationships with communities and partners. And with the on-country programs, Indigenous including into stakeholder initiatives and the decision-making. These are just 5 little key circles, learning circles, that I hope can influence a greater or widening your vision on how we can do this better together. And resourcing that is very important. Now, we do an acknowledgement of country and we have a welcome to country. I want to clearly state they are just today's welcome to countries and acknowledgement of countries is just modern day interpretations of an ancient custom and practice where one seeks and receives permission to move through lands beyond our traditional boundaries or our nations. I'm currently coming in from the Barkindji Marara lands, and the warm and sincere welcome we got this morning in our workshop was just fantastic. And I am always grateful for the generosity and the warm and sincere way that we are welcomed to country. That should just be a step in the right direction. You know, some people said to me, you know, I was sitting with a young gentleman at Macquarie University last week, and he actually said to me, he said, well, you know, how do you engage with Aboriginal people? And I turned to him and he said, you look confused. I said, well, we've been talking for about half an hour. Is that communication? I think it is. Examples of what we can do, again, come back, we are only limited by our imagination. Working with Indigenous communities. One of the fundamental skills lacking in Indigenous communities is writing applications or funding applications, submissions, you know, developing projects together. That can be a two-way, you know, co-designing and developing projects, strategies, plans to look at threatened species, doing cultural surveying and mapping, the education, school programs, you know, demonstration reaches where we can, you know, encourage our schools and our tertiary institutions to adopt the Reach a River, open community field days and festivals, language programs, technical advice. This is a key one for me. Integrating our cultural science with Western science to make it a complete science. We can do that. Our cultural science is being validated every day in what we do. And we have lived with Western science that has helped shape our desire to make it a better science by including our cultural values and the cultural methodology on the platform of this profound symbiotic relationship we have. Running workshops together with community groups, looking at water resource plans. We are still operating in a vacuum as far as I'm concerned with water resource plans. Wetland management. So wetland management, wetlands are our supermarkets, and they still are. And we want to be involved in the long-term sustainability. We shouldn't be disconnecting our supermarkets from our arteries. They are living, breathing entities. If we only got to look across the ditch to our Maori brothers and sisters and how they've had the Wanganui and the Waikato River recognised as living, breathing entities. The Barker, to the Barkindji people, the Barkindji Marara people, the Barker is a living, breathing entity. And when you look at the quality of the water and when there are flows, communities are happy. They can fish, they can hunt, they can gather. And again, we want to be involved in the emergency responses to save the fish, because we have very, very strong totemic relationships with fish. Tree planting for riparian. We want to be in drought management. We have existed in this country called Australia, the driest inhabited continent on this planet. We have existed with it. We have been resilient, and we continue to be resilient and interact as we go forward. And testimony to that is the last census clearly articulates, and the Closing the Gap report released this year in March, clearly shows that we have grown in population to 2.8%. And I believe that our cultural connection, our cultural way of life, and looking at alternative health ways of healing ourselves, going back to our traditional ways of it, has been very much a party to that. Our life expectancy has grown a little bit, not much, but in the health arena, they have turned the models upside down and are now looking at Aboriginal way of life, Aboriginal healing, and these native vegetation that has fantastic and unbelievable medicinal values. And I think the other thing is around these on-ground country works. We need to be able to do this. As I mentioned, we're going to be going forward with less and less resources. So collaborations at the community coalface, rural, remote, isolated communities across our wonderful basin. We can do this together. We're seeing it happen, but there's got to be a greater appreciation and respect for us to be involved in the decision-making around water and the connectivity from the top to the bottom. Because we think in systems, we think spatially, we think temporally, but we also think upstream to our people upstream, but we also have a profound responsibility to think downstream. As a Gomeroi man, I and my people and our native title claim, we have a profound sense of justice to make sure that whatever we can get out of the 6 dams that exist on our nation, if we can increase the pulses that connect rivers to rivers, valley to valley, and connects into the wonderful Menindee system, then we are playing our role and supporting the Barkindji downstream. Nobody should be able to live with a lack of water. It is a human thing. It is a community thing. It is a rite of passage for us to be involved in these decision-making. Now, when we come to this knowledge, I sat here this morning with the Barkindji Marara people, and they talked about 7 seasons. And then you look at the 6 seasons with the Larrakia people. Then we talk about fire and fire stick management with Victor Stephenson coming down from the Cape to educate us. In New South Wales, their fire stick management from an Aboriginal perspective is now part of the rural fire services in the way they manage the lands and those landscapes that they are responsible for. But it took a catastrophic event early this year for that to be realised. And as we see the fires in California raging and millions of land and trees destroyed, we are now hearing from non-Aboriginal people in America that they should be talking to the First Nation people of America about how they interacted with their forests and their cultural landscapes with fire. So I talk about how we can make a difference together. We've got these new initiatives called environmental watering advisory groups, which to me, I think is a wonderful opportunity and a great platform for Aboriginal people, non-Aboriginal people, water utility users, farmers, irrigators, green groups, local government to be sitting together to look at how we can maximise a pulse or a volume of water to reach a destination. This is the Guida wetlands in April 2018. This is the Guida wetlands in October 2018. It was that collective group who are members of the Guida Environmental Watering Advisory Group that created that. And it was on the back of their willingness and desire to understand that this is a site of significance. This is not just a wetland. This has the cultural values unlimited for the Gomeroi people. And the question I ask you is, do you want a piece of this action with us? Because you can. And there are many other wetlands where you can start this to work together to keep these supermarkets and these bird breeding, fish spawning areas alive. So I think the other thing I want to talk to you about is we've done the barn dance, we've learnt to waltz. Can you dance with us? Can you shake a leg with us? Do you want to shake a leg with us? Do you want to make the earth move? Because we can have a greater rumble together. We can have this impact. And that's a picture of the Garma Festival. And I always say, don't let the sun set without the effort. Let's learn something from one another every day. And let's take that opportunity to educate and support tomorrow's scientists, to support tomorrow's champions, both Indigenous and non-Indigenous. And I just want to say, we have no word for goodbye. But before I say your name, which is will go, I use my totems in this journey. The Yutundali, the Goanna, always climbing, curious, always looking towards the sky, wanting a better way of life, wanting to do something. Let's not be like the dhinawan, the emu, and go at it at fast pace. Because sometimes we hit an obstacle and we could end up in a destination that couldn't be any further than where we wanted to be. I want us to be like Biggie Billa, the echidna, the porcupine. I want us to be nice and steady, making sure that we are learning everything we need to learn as we go forward together. And the tool site in the middle is that at Terry High High, our tool site in the middle of the Terry High High Creek, which is now a dust bowl. That is the type of legacy that I want to be involved in working with you, that we want to leave for our next generations. So I again come back to my opening cliche is, I hope I've informed you. I hope I've challenged you. I hope I've created a greater curiosity for you to explore and be with us, because we can be better together. And I say, Yanay, or Marabu, which is thank you, and Yanay.
Thanks so much, Phil. That was an absolutely wonderful and stimulating lecture. You mentioned both at the start and you came back to talk about stimulating that curiosity, and I think you've done an absolutely amazing job of doing that tonight. So thank you. We have now got some time for questions, and we've got a few that are coming in from the audience members. We'll obviously have a time at the end too to thank Phil. I'll turn to questions now. So we've got one here. Phil, you've talked about cultural flows, and there's a question here which is asking about whether you can provide any perspective on also a cultural economy.
we bartered. We were sustainable people. We used to barter with fish. We used to barter with the pelts of like Bunda the kangaroo. So it was an exchange. What have you got that can help me and my clan and my family? And so that exchange happened up and down the basin across this nation. We hear stories about people coming together, or many nations coming together to do that. Business and governance and the exchanges based on the cultural economy. And I do believe that cultural flows and environmental flows coexist. I believe that the synergies in outcomes from both those brands of water clearly provide the platform for them to come together. If we can increase the environmental outcomes by adding a cultural pulse behind an environmental pulse, I think that's the opportunity that we and the potential we can realize together. Because again, they do coexist, but there's got to be a greater uptake of the cultural flows. I think one of the key missing ingredients for people that they don't understand is what I call the intangible. So whilst we have all the physical and visible outcomes of interweaving cultural water and cultural flows together, it's the intangible, the spiritual connection that people don't get about that profound connection to country. But we can educate people on that. I believe there are people out there that are currently doing it, such as the Murray Lower Darling Rivers Indigenous nations. They are doing a wonderful job in this part of the world.
Fantastic, thank you, Phil. One of our audience members has noted that the Indigenous population is grossly underrepresented in terms of water licence ownership, and asks the question as to, given the recent announcement from Minister Pitt around no additional water buybacks, whether you might comment on the way forward in terms of increasing Indigenous water ownership.
In New South Wales, we've seen an amazing decrease of 17% of Aboriginal water holdings across the state over the past 10 years. I believe that can be rectified. I believe that we need to, for Aboriginal people to realise our potential in the planning and decision making around water resource plans, water sharing plans, regional water strategies, we need to be given an allocation that gives us a seat at the table. There is plenty of water for us all. We just want to play our role. We have a right to play that role. But I don't like coming into those discussions from a rights position. We all know Aboriginal people have rights. We all know that. I want to come at from a goodwill, a game-changing difference, and setting up our future for our next generations of scientists and our young people, because we will be judged on the state of the environment that we leave our next generations. That is a no-brainer. You know, I've got a 7-year-old granddaughter, and she says to me, "Pop, what are you doing about this water stuff? We got a mob out there, they don't know." So it's got to come from a good, and if you're going to do it from an obligation, it won't work. Do it because you want to make a difference. Don't do it because it's an obligation. You will fail.
Thanks, Phil. We've got another question here, prefaced by a comment, what a wonderful presentation. The question is, what do you think is the most important thing that we can do now to get that collaboration that you speak of happening?
Talk, walk and talk together. Get out with the people on country. Introduce yourself, form a relationship. We are an aging population. Our knowledge holders are our elders. And I don't want to see our elders passing over into the big sky camp or the dream time and taking that knowledge with them. I think that goodwill to say, okay, I'm here. I want to learn. I want to sit with you on your country. I want to listen. I want to learn, because I want to make a difference. And it can take one person. And Nick, you know, I've sat with you and I've challenged you. both professionally and socially, about our way of life. And that has formed that relationship that you and I have. Everybody should have that opportunity to have this relationship and knowledge sharing opportunity, because that's the future. We are not going to have buckets, endless, bottomless buckets of resources or money to go forward. But are we willing to use what's in here to be better together?
Fantastic, Phil. Thank you. There's a comment here, just someone saying that they love the better together and nothing about us without us, as really, really important messages. So thank you for that. There is a question here which I'm going to bring up, which is just to get your thoughts on the sad images we see of sometimes rivers such as the Lower Darling when they're in particularly poor state, and whether you can just comment on that.
Our traditional owners, they exist in harmony and in pain. At the moment, there is a lot of pain. There is a lot of pain because there's a sense of helplessness. We can't influence the connectivity of our arteries to support water coming in to that, and I'll use the Menindee Lake system. We all understand the lower lakes and the Coorong, how important, how profoundly important they are. But for me, one of the key health indicators of the system is that wonderful Menindee Lake system. Tandao, Parramaru, Corndilla, Menindee, water is the lifeline. And you've only got to go out and sit with the people like I did last week. And there is a sense of sadness to their voices, to their tone, a sense of helplessness. So the question I have to ask the audience, do you want to help? And, ask yourself the question then, if the answer is yes, how can I do this? And it starts with an extended hand, a step in the right direction to form the relationship.
Fantastic. Look, we've got lots of questions coming in. There's a whole range of issues that are being raised. There's one here which I'll just quickly ask you, which is whether you'd have anywhere in particular, as well as obviously that notion of extending a hand and actually starting to form a relationship and talking. Is there anywhere you'd suggest people go to educate themselves and to gain more information?
Start with the local people in your communities. Start within those nations where you exist. Earlier on, I showed an image of me standing under our family birthing tree. That was taken when I took 14 PhD candidates from Macquarie University to Moree out to on not just to Terry High, but out to the Guida wetlands. And that has had a profound impact on the geography and planning unit or department in Macquarie University. Indigenous knowledge is now interwoven throughout the curricula. And there is a continuation of a link to the Gomeroi Nation from Macquarie and the Guida and the Macquarie Marshes. Tertiary institutions can play a fantastic role in facilitating that. And then again, we go look at our high schools and our primary schools. They should have the same responsibilities. So start within your local footprint. Start within your local footprint and then grow out from there. And if you don't know anybody, ask somebody. Use your voices. Because, I look forward to the day that I come down to La Trobe University and hopefully continue this yarn to continue to influence not just La Trobe, the Rivers Institute at Griffith University, where my colleague and wonderful friend Stuart Bunn and Sue Jackson exist, to the Lee Baumgartners of Charles Sturt University, Adelaide, wherever you go. And, one of the great mentors of my life was Marcia Langton, Melbourne University. And her support and dedication, particularly not only across the rights arena, but now in natural resource management, is testimony to what we can do together and how we can be better together.
Thanks so much, Phil. Look, we are going to have to draw the questions to a close there. I might just finish with one of the comments that's come in from an audience member, which both thanks you for a wonderful presentation, but also emphasises that your message about goodwill rather than obligation is a really important one, and the fact that we ultimately we all work better together when we work from values than from rules. And I think that's a really nice comment from the audience to finish on. I'd like to thank you personally, before I hand over to Bruce Mann, to thank you on behalf of the Mann family for tonight's lecture. Thank you.
Okay, thanks Nick, thanks Phil, and thanks to everyone who's come along. This is certainly a very different format for the Mann Lecture. The 18th Mann Lecture, I actually thought it was more than that, but I'll take it that it's the 18th. And I think it's highly appropriate that Phil spoke. There are clearly some major challenges that we all face with the Murray River, the Murray-Darling Basin, and we've had a lot of very insightful talks over the years. This is one that reminds us that there have been people living around, caring for the river for thousands of years, and we are foolish as well. We're foolish if we aren't sharing and learning from all of the information that's there. That's a selfish way of looking at it. The moral approach is that this is something that we just must do. I really enjoyed your talk, Phil. It's a pity we can't have dinner afterwards to talk some more. But thank you for your lecture. Thank you for all the work that you've done. And again, pleasure on behalf of the Mann family. Very pleased that we can continue to support the lecture and look forward to doing it the old-fashioned way next year. Thank you very much.
Well, Bruce, Marabu, which is thank you. But Bruce, on behalf of me and my family, my clan and my nation, I would like to present you with a message stick from the Gomeroi people to you and your family. It has all my totems on it. It also shows you the many water holes across my country. Obviously, it's done in colour. That is special to us as a people. And I would love to break bread with you and present this to you and your family in person in the not too distant future. It is just a mere gesture of the wonderful support that you provide to La Trobe University and supporting next generation's leaders that come out of our tertiary institutions. So I say thank you, Bruce, Marabu, and I can't wait to present this to you personally.
Thank you very much. That's very touching. Thank you. All right. Well, usually I would now invite everyone out for a drink. So I think what I actually need to do is invite everyone to go and have a drink with your family, and everyone have a very pleasant evening. Thank you very much.
One last thing, Nick, Rachel, Catherine's not with us. Please send my sincerest thoughts to Catherine and her family with what's happened. But Nick, my Duncan, my brother, can't wait to see you. And thank you for this wonderful opportunity. And Gwen, thank you for stepping in, and thank you for starting our relationship. Though it's in the Zoom, can't wait to see you face to face too. So Marabu and Yane to everybody, and to everybody that's taken the time to be near, I thank you from the bottom of my heart, and I hope that you've enjoyed it. Yane.
Thank you.
Thanks so much, Phil. Yes, absolutely.
Yeah.
And thanks to all of our audience members tonight. I have no doubt you've enjoyed Phil's presentation. It's been absolutely fantastic. And as you say, Phil, we look forward to continuing these conversations in person soon. Thank you.
Thank you, Phil. That was a really wonderful lecture. Yeah. You all you set out at the start. You got our curiosity. You got us thinking differently. It's fabulous. Thank you.
This is just the start of my relationship with La Trobe. You can lock me in any time you want me to come down and have a yarn.
Great. We'll do that.
Thanks again, Phil. And I think that concludes tonight's session. So yeah, thanks again to everyone for attending, and thanks again, Phil.
I'll see you in a couple of weeks.
Great work. Bye, everyone.
Bye, Gwen.
Bye.
Bye.